The first thing Kaya heard when she came back to consciousness was the rain. Not the polite drizzle of downtown Atlanta where she grew up, but a heavy, furious downpour that hammered the steel walls of whatever building she was being held in like it had a personal grudge. The second thing she heard was a voice she recognized. Smooth, calm, and absolutely terrifying. She's awake. 3 weeks earlier, Kaya Odoms had been standing in the parking lot of a payday loan office in Itaewon, staring at an eviction notice she'd printed from her phone and wondering exactly where her life had gone wrong. She was 29. She had a culinary certificate from a school that no longer existed, a knife roll worth more than her bank account, and exactly one professional reference from a man who'd fired her 6 months ago.
After his restaurant got shut down by health inspectors. Which was not her fault, but she'd been the one holding the fish when the inspector walked in. So, that was the story of Kaya Odoms.
Wrong place, wrong moment, wrong amount of money in the wrong account. The ad had appeared in her email the way terrible decisions usually did. At 2 a.m., when desperation had worn down every reasonable instinct she'd ever possessed. Private household chef sought, immediate placement, compensation, exceptional, discretion, mandatory. The address they'd sent her was 40 kilometers outside Seoul, carved into the side of a mountain that didn't appear on any civilian map she could find. She went anyway, because the number they'd listed had 6 zeros before a decimal point, and a woman with $6 in her account doesn't ask too many questions about geography. The SUV that picked her up had tinted windows and a driver who hadn't said a single word during the 2-hour climb. When the vehicle finally stopped, Kaya stepped out into cold mountain air and looked up at a structure that shouldn't have existed. A fortress of poured concrete and black glass, embedded into the rock face like something from a film about the end of the world. Men with rifles stood at the gate. More lined the interior courtyard, silent as columns, watching her with the particular flat attention of people who'd stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. They walked her through a kitchen that made her catch her breath despite herself. It was enormous. Stainless steel and brushed copper, marble counters, every tool she'd ever dreamed of owning, laid out like an altar to a god of heat and salt. She was still taking it in when the far door opened and the air in the room changed. Kwon Taesung was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known enough to expect anything in particular. He was tall. Korean men weren't supposed to be that tall. That was her first irrelevant thought, with a face that might have been beautiful if it had ever learned to rest into anything other than cold displeasure. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie. The tattoos that crept up from beneath his collar and disappeared past his jawline told her everything the suit was meant to conceal. "You are the fourth," he said. His English was flawless, accented just enough to make the words land with weight. "The 3 before you failed." Kaya set her knife roll on the counter. Failed at what? He looked at her for a long moment in the way that men look at things they're deciding whether or not to crush. Then something moved across his face. Just for a second, just enough to be human. And it looked like grief. "My mother," he said. "She has refused food for nearly 4 months. The doctors have found nothing. She declines." A pause that cost him something. She is wasting away inside her own home, and no one in this house has been able to stop it. He stepped closer. The scent of cedar and expensive restraint reached her before he did. "Cook for her tonight," Taesung said. "She eats, you stay. She doesn't eat." He left the rest in the silence. He didn't need to finish it. "You understand me." Kaya understood perfectly. Her heart was hammering against her sternum in double time, but she had learned long ago never to let fear show on her face. Fear was just adrenaline. Adrenaline was just fuel. "What did the other three cook?" she asked. He named the dishes: French technique, Japanese presentation. One had been a molecular gastronomy specialist who'd spent most of her loan money training under a chef whose food looked like art and tasted like distance. Kaya looked at the walk-in refrigerator and felt something settle in her chest. Not calm exactly, more like the locked-in focus of a woman who had no margin for error. "Get out of my kitchen," she said, "and leave me alone for 2 hours." He stared at her. His men at the door stiffened. Then Kwan Tae-sung turned and walked out without another word, and Kaya got to work. She ignored the dry-aged cuts in the refrigerator. She walked past the saffron and the imported finishing salts and the sort of ingredients that belonged in competitions, not conversations. She dug until she found the bones. Pork neck, marrow thick and generous. And she started a broth the way her grandmother had taught her in a kitchen in Decatur, Georgia, with the kind of patience that smelled like Sunday morning and couldn't be rushed for anything. She built it up slow: the bones, the scorched ginger and garlic. She charred in a dry pan until the kitchen smelled like something alive. She braised the collards down until they were silk, hit them with a sharp splash of rice vinegar and a whisper of Korean chili that bloomed against the richness. She made dumplings by hand, not the delicate pleated kind, but thick, soft rounds of dough that dropped into the broth and soaked up everything around them. When Tae-sung came back 2 hours later, the kitchen was warm for the first time. Not the clinical, expensive warmth of a room with good insulation, but the aggressive, claiming warmth of food that meant something. He didn't say a word. He just picked up the tray. Kaya followed him down a corridor so long and dim it felt like walking into the past. Madame Kwan was lying in the center of a bed so large it swallowed her. She was thin in the way that frightened people. The kind of thin that happens when a body stops fighting, and her eyes were open but pointed at the ceiling in the way of someone who had stopped seeing what was in front of them. Tae-sung sat on the edge of the mattress. He became, in that moment, someone entirely different, not a man who held rifles and silence and power, but a son. His hands were careful when he lifted the spoon. His voice, when he spoke to his mother in Korean, was lower than Kaya had heard it, soft in the way of things that don't trust themselves to be louder. She almost looked away. It felt private in the way of grief. But she watched, because she needed to see. The steam from the broth curled into the still air of the room. That was what reached Madame Kwan first. Not sound, not touch, but scent. Something in the old woman's body remembered it before her mind did. Her nose moved. Her eyes shifted from the ceiling, small and slow, until they found the bowl. Tae-sung brought the spoon to her lips. She opened them. When she swallowed and then reached for more, the guards standing at the walls turned to stone. Tae-sung's hand trembled once before he controlled it. Kaya pressed herself back against the doorframe and breathed through her nose and did not let herself make a sound. The most feared man in Seoul was crying without crying, jaw locked, eyes burning, feeding his mother soup, spoonful by careful spoonful. Kaya walked back to the kitchen and sat on the floor against the cold marble island and stared at the ceiling and thought about her grandmother's hands. She wasn't fired, she wasn't killed, she wasn't even asked to leave. She was absorbed. A room appeared for her. East wing, windows that looked out over the pine ridges, a door that locked from the outside. The guards who stood in the hallway were polite, in a way that left no ambiguity about what they were. Her knives were returned to her every morning and taken back every night. She was a prize in a cage, and the cage was beautiful, and none of that changed what it was. Madame Kwan began to recover. It happened in increments, the way all true things do. First the broth, then questions about the broth, then the day the wheelchair appeared in the kitchen doorway with a sharp-eyed woman in it who watched Kaya work for 40 minutes without speaking. By the end of the second week, the wheelchair was gone, replaced by a cane. By the end of the third, Madame Kwan was critiquing her knife work. "You waste the heel of the onion," the older woman said one afternoon, seated at the island with a cup of barley tea warming her hands. "I use it for stock," Kaya said, not looking up from the cutting board. A pause. "Your garlic proportion is aggressive." "It's supposed to be. My grandmother said, if the neighbors can't smell it, you haven't started yet." A sound from Madame Kwan that took Kaya a second to identify as a laugh, small and rusty, like a door that hadn't opened in a while. "Your grandmother," the older woman said, "understood something." "She understood everything," Kaya said, scraping the onion into the pan. "I just understand the cooking part." Madame Kwan smiled, and it fit her face like it had always belonged there, and Kaya understood then that this woman was the reason she hadn't found a way out yet. Not the money, not the locked door, this. Taesung started appearing in the kitchen the way weather appears. Without announcement, without obvious cause, with the full force of something that had decided to be there. He would lean against the doorframe and watch her. Not the way the guards watched, cataloging and reporting, but differently. The particular focused attention of a man working out a problem he couldn't name. "You're doing it again," Kaya said, on the fourth evening of it, without turning from the stove. "Doing what?" "Standing there like a very expensive coat rack." Silence. "Then I'm observing." "Observe from outside the kitchen." He didn't move. "You are an anomaly, Kaya. I have been trying to determine how you achieved what 3 others couldn't." "I cooked real food." She turned to look at him. The distance between them was 10 feet and felt like considerably less. "Food that smells like somewhere." "Your mother wasn't waiting for perfect technique. She was waiting for something that reminded her she was supposed to still be here." He looked at her with the expression of a man filing information. She turned back to the stove before her face could betray her. He started finding reasons to be near her, security inspections of her ingredients, mandatory tastings of her sauces. He would appear at her shoulder without sound, close enough that she could feel the ambient heat of him, and she would hold herself very still and concentrate on the sauce, the heat, the salt, everything except the fact that this man made her nervous in a way that had nothing to do with the guns. The evening she was reducing a dark soy and pear glaze for braised short ribs, he appeared behind her and leaned forward to look at the pan, his chest nearly at her shoulder, and said, low and unhurried, "Taste it. It needs another 4 minutes. Taste it." She took the spoon, blew across it, put it to her mouth, hit the back of her throat with a wave of sweet salt-bitter heat that was almost right, not quite. She lowered the spoon. When she turned, he was watching her mouth. "Well," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Slowly, the way you'd approach something that might bolt, and turned her wrist until the light caught a small dark bead of glaze on the side of her thumb. She watched, completely unable to produce a coherent thought, as he bent his head and touched his lips to her skin, taking the drop of glaze with a careful deliberateness that went straight through her like a current. He lifted his head. His eyes, when they met hers, were a different temperature than usual. "Heavy on the pear," he said. His voice had dropped a register. "Balance it." He walked out. Kaya stood at the stove for a solid minute without moving, her thumb pressed to her own lips, thinking about dangerous things. She found the vial on a Thursday. She'd been cleaning the back corner of the walk-in pantry, reorganizing the shelves, working through the inventory left by the three chefs before her, when she moved a heavy wooden box of Alba truffles that had been sitting untouched since she'd arrived. Wedged into the wall, behind it was a small alcove, carved neatly into the wood paneling. Inside the alcove was a glass vial, thumb-length, sealed with a rubber stopper. Inside the vial was a fine white crystalline powder. No label, no smell when she cracked the seal a fraction. She stood in the cold of the pantry and thought about the three chefs before her. The refined techniques, the precise plating, the kind of delicate, controlled food where a pinch of tasteless, odorless powder would dissolve without a trace. She thought about the luxury ingredients she hadn't touched once, the finishing salts, the truffle oils, the caviar. She'd brought her own spices. She'd used the broth bones from the back of the freezer, not the prepared stock in the front. She hadn't cooked with a single thing that had been opened before she arrived. She looked at the vial. She thought about Madame Kwan laughing at a story about garlic. Kaya closed the pantry door, tucked the vial into the pocket of her apron, and walked directly to the west wing of the house. Two guards blocked her in the corridor outside Taisong's study. She stared at them until they flinched, which took approximately 4 seconds. "Tell him the chef is here," she said. "Tell him it's not about the food." The doors opened. She walked in. The room was dark wood and old whiskey, and the kind of silence that meant power. Taesung stood from behind his desk when she entered, scanning her, face, hands, the set of her posture, with the rapid clinical attention of someone who understood threat assessment. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Kaya walked to the desk and put the vial down on its surface. It made a clean, small sound. The temperature in the room changed. Taesung looked at the vial, then at her. She told him. All of it. The hidden alcove, the untouched pantry items, the pattern she'd pieced together. While she spoke, she watched his face very carefully, and what she saw was not the anger she expected but something worse. The face of a man revising everything he thought he knew about the last 4 months. "My food didn't cure her," Kaya said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I just stopped feeding her what was killing her. I was too stubborn to use the previous chef's ingredients and too broke to know better." Taesung had gone still in the way of something coiled. "Someone in this house," he said, the words precise and deliberate, "has full access to this kitchen, to the pantry inventory, to the supply chain." He looked up from the desk and his eyes held a fury so controlled it was worse than shouting. "You have just told me that someone very close to me has been murdering my mother." A pause. "And by doing so, you've given them a reason to make sure you don't get to tell anyone else." "I know," Kaya said. "I'm telling you anyway." He stared at her for a long moment, then he pressed his hand over hers on the desk, warm and sudden, and said very quietly, "Why?" "Because she's a good person. Simple as that. And this isn't right." The way he looked at her after that was something she didn't have a word for. Like a man who had just watched something, he'd stopped believing and walked back into the room. The dinner came together in 3 hours. Taesung summoned his senior lieutenants under the pretext of celebrating Madame Kwan's recovery. A formal dinner. The best food Kaya had ever cooked, because if she was going to be the bait in a trap, she was going to be excellent bait. She noted the one called Baek Sungjin, the household overseer, the man who managed the estate's imports and supply logistics, polished, warm, silver-haired in a way that made him look trustworthy. She watched his hands all through the appetizers and the main and the pause before dessert, and she didn't look away. When she brought out the final course, a single bowl of restorative broth set on a lacquered tray for Madame Kwan, Baek Sungjin stood before anyone asked him to. "Let me carry it," he said warmly, moving around the table. "I've attended to this family for 30 years. It would honor me." Taesung said, "Of course," and didn't move a muscle. Kaya watched Sungjin's left hand as he reached for the garnish bowl. She saw the gesture, almost nothing, a flick of 2 fingers, and the small folded packet that appeared from inside his sleeve. She said, "Stop." But Taesung's hand had already moved. The steak knife buried itself through the back of Sungjin's hand, pinning it to the table with a sound that turned every man at the dinner to stone. The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Sungjin screamed, and the windows came apart. The firefight was fast and absolute and terrifying. Taesung's men swarmed the room from the corridor. Sungjin's outside operatives came in through the shattered terrace windows. Kaya hit the floor behind the overturned serving cart, her ears ringing, pressing her hands flat against the hardwood, thinking, in the strange, clear way that extreme danger sometimes produces, that she had survived worse than this. She had survived debt collectors, and an eviction and a restaurant fire, and the look on her mother's face when Kaya told her she was going back to Korea to try again. She was not going to die in a dining room in Seoul. In the chaos of Sungjin's loyalists retreating under fire, she didn't see him get free. She just saw the knife left behind, pinning nothing but wood. The blood trail led out through the broken window into the dark. And she saw Taesung, crouched behind the overturned table, scanning for her, and when he found her, when their eyes locked across the ruined dining room, something in his face unlocked that she had never seen in it before. She knew, right then, that staying here would kill her, and she knew, just as clearly, that leaving would do something worse to him. She went anyway. The secondary gate code had been changed. She was standing at the iron bars in the cold, a paring knife tucked against her hip, and her knife rolled over her shoulder, when a shadow moved among the pines. "It was changed 10 minutes ago," Taesung said. He came into the thin moonlight looking nothing like himself. No suit, a black utility sweater, dark pants, soot from the firefight still smeared at his jaw. He looked like he'd run here from somewhere, which he probably had. He held out his hand. In it was a leather pouch and a set of keys. $50,000, he said. His voice was a low, careful thing. "Armored vehicle a quarter-mile down the access road. Full tank. My pilot is waiting on the other side of the mountain. A beat. He has instructions to take you anywhere in the world you choose." Kaya stared at his outstretched hand, at the keys. "You're letting me go," she said. "I'm trying to be something better than what I am." The words came out rough, like they hurt him. "My selfishness put you in that dining room. My need to keep you Blues gave Sungjin exactly what he needed to come after me through you." He looked down at the keys in his palm. "You are the first good thing to happen inside these walls in a very long time, Kaya. And I have been holding you here like something I own." His jaw tightened. "Take the money, take the car, run before he finds another angle." She looked at the keys, she looked at his face. She pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. His heart was hammering. "Taesung," she started. The gate came apart. The armored van hit it at speed, and the iron buckled, and the explosion of it threw them both sideways. Kaya hit the wet grass, rolled, came up bleeding from her palm, and found 2 men already on her. Sungjin's people, the ones who'd been waiting in the access road for exactly this. She fought. She always fought. But there were 2 of them, and when the butt of a rifle connected with her temple, the world turned white, and then nothing. She came back to consciousness on a concrete floor that smelled of brine and machine oil, wrists zip-tied, head splitting, somewhere along the Seoul waterfront by the smell of it. Sung-jin was sitting on a crate across from her, his hand wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, his face a pale, satisfied ruin. "You cost me 4 months of planning," he said. Not angry, almost complimentary. "And a hand. That's the most anyone's cost me in 30 years. Kaya turned her head, catalogued the space. Warehouse, industrial, high shattered skylights, and began to methodically assess what was in it. One guard near the door, one near the back wall, a rusted utility sink, shelving unit, cleaning supply jugs. She was a chef. She knew her chemistry. Sung-jin talked. She let him. She was calculating quantities and reaction time, and the distance between the guard's position and the sink. When the guard near the back wall pulled out a cigarette and turned half away from her, she moved. Sodium hydroxide from the industrial drain cleaner, the leaking utility tap, a wide-mouthed glass jar. The guard heard the hiss of the exothermic reaction and turned toward her just as she threw the contents. The sound he made was terrible. The sound of the front wall of the warehouse being blown inward was worse, and also the best thing she'd ever heard. Taesung didn't negotiate. He never had. He came through the wreckage at the front of a column of his men, a tactical shotgun in his hands, and a look in his eyes that Kaya would describe later. To no one, because she'd never tell this story to anyone who hadn't lived it, as the look of a man who had stopped caring about consequences. The warehouse was secured in 4 minutes. She counted. When he found her, sitting against the shelving unit, wrists still bound, covered in concrete dust and someone else's bad choices, he dropped to his knees on the filthy floor in front of her. The most feared man in Seoul, kneeling on a warehouse floor, his hands shaking as he snapped the zip ties with his bare hands. He pulled her against his chest. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "I've got you," he said finally, his voice rough against her hair. "I've got you. I'm sorry. God, I've got you." She pressed her hands flat against his back and felt him shaking and decided, quietly and without ceremony, that she was done running. The summit was held in the grand ballroom of a neutral hotel in Gangnam 3 weeks later. Kaya wore a deep plum gown she'd been given no choice about, and diamonds that rested cold and heavy at her throat, and she walked into a room full of the most dangerous men in South Korea on Taesung's arm, with her spine straight and her chin level. He walked her to the head of the table. He pulled out the chair at the absolute apex of the room, the one that meant something specific to everyone present, and he looked at her, and she sat. The room erupted in exactly the murmur she'd expected. One of the bosses across the table, an older man, scarred at the cheek, slapped his palm flat on the mahogany and said, "Kwan, this is a room of blood and business. Your staff does not sit at this table." Taesung moved behind her. His hands settled on her shoulders. She felt the weight of them like ballast. "Her name," he said, "is Kaya." The room went very quiet. "She saved my mother's life. She uncovered the traitor in my house while my own men walked that pantry every single day. She survived Baek Sung-jin's people using nothing but a chemistry lesson and her own hands." His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly. "She sits where she sits because I say she does, and I say it because she has earned every centimeter of that chair." A pause that had an edge to it. If any man at this table addresses her as anything less than what she is, we will have a very short and very final conversation about respect. The scarred boss looked at her, then he lowered his head. One by one, the room followed. Kaya held very still and let the diamonds rest heavy at her throat and breathed through it and thought about her grandmother's kitchen in Decatur, Georgia, and how the woman had always said that the table you build is the table you eat at. The dining room at the estate was restored by the time autumn settled over the mountain. Bulletproof glass in the new windows, fresh floors. The kitchen exactly the way she'd left it, because she'd left very specific instructions, and nobody in this house was brave enough to deviate from them. On the first night that felt like a real evening, just the three of them, Kaya at the stove, Taesung pouring wine, Madame Kwan already seated and offering opinions on the aroma from the hallway. Kaya made everything she loved. Fried chicken, buttermilk brined for 24 hours, braised short ribs with pear and soy and black pepper that had been slow cooking since morning, macaroni with a sharp cheddar and a soft Gouda, baked until the top was blistered and golden. Kimchi from the batch Madame Kwan had helped her make the week before, tart and vivid and full of the particular pride of something you made yourself. Taesung came up behind her while she was plating, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and pressed his face into the curve of her neck. "You're going to burn the ribs," she said. "The ribs are fine," he said. Taesung. Kaya. She elbowed him gently in the sternum. He let her go, laughing, a real laugh, the unguarded kind she was still getting used to, and picked up the wine decanter. Dinner was loud and easy and warm, and Madame Kwan ate more than Kaya had ever seen her eat in one sitting, and then told a story about Taesung at 7 years old, trying to smuggle a dog into his school inside his backpack, and Kaya laughed until her face hurt. The knock came during dessert. Taesung's new head of security stood in the doorway, holding a small flat package, brown paper, no return address, left at the service gate by a courier who'd vanished before he could be stopped, swept clean for everything they knew to sweep for. It was addressed to Kaya. She set down her spoon. She opened it. Inside was a tin box she recognized before her brain had fully processed what she was looking at. She'd kept that tin on her kitchen counter in Atlanta for 3 years. She'd lost it somewhere in the chaos of the last year and hadn't been able to bring herself to replace it because it had belonged to her father. And her father had been dead for 7 years, killed in a robbery in New Orleans, and she had identified the body herself. Inside the tin was a single index card, yellowed, spotted with old grease, handwriting she would know anywhere. Her father's recipe for seafood gumbo, the same card she had memorized when she was 6 years old, the same card she had last seen in her own kitchen 6,000 miles away. She heard Taesung set his glass down. Under the card was a folded sheet sealed with red wax. He opened it, read it, said nothing for a long moment. "What?" Kaya said, very carefully. He put the paper on the table between them, face up. "We are aware of your new domestic arrangement, Chairman Kwan. The woman you have brought into your house carries a debt that does not belong to her. It belongs to her father, who stole from our family before he disappeared. The debt passes to blood. We will be in touch. Moretti." The candles at the center of the table cast everything in gold. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines in the long, steady way of things that don't hurry. Taesung raised his head. His eyes found hers across the warm ruin of their dinner, and what she saw in them was not fear. She had never once seen fear in this man, but something absolute, territorial, already decided. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Tell me about your father," he said quietly. "Everything, from the beginning." Kaya looked at the index card, at the handwriting she had memorized when she was 6 years old, standing on a step stool in a kitchen that smelled like the Gulf. She opened her mouth. And somewhere in New York, a phone rang.